following podcast is brought to you by fantasy-animation.org, an online educational resource dedicated to the academic discussion of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. We publish weekly blogs and bi-weekly podcasts just like these, and there's a whole manner of resources available on our website for you to check out, engage with, find out more about, and then take part in the conversation afterwards. To do that, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit at the handle FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research, and we really look forward to hearing from you. For now, do enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I believe I am awake and I am Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday and I'm dreaming.
But we'll both desperately cling to our totems to make sure throughout the duration of the episode. As hinted, today we are talking about the Christopher Nolan movie Inception, the heist dream thriller from a few years ago that sort of stormed cinemas with its sort of mixture of cryptic narrative and blockbuster visuals, and there's lots to talk about in terms of its riffing on sci-fi cinema, its use of dream imagery and the relationship between ideas of, oniric film theory and fantasy cinema. Chris, VFX-wise, there's got to be loads to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's a really great film to sort of think about visual effects and the potential of and the sort of spectatorial power of visual effects. I think their relationship to narrative, what they do in relation to a narrative that is highly complex. Actually, I think the effects in the film are sort of perhaps one of the most coherent elements of the film. So, yeah, and there's been a bit of writing as well around Inception and its sort of time spaces. So, yeah, really excited to get going on this one.
And we have a very special guest on the podcast this week to help us think through some of these ideas and more. Professor Todd McGowan from the University of Vermont in the Department of English, who is an extremely prolific author of many aspects of film theory, including psychoanalysis, existentialism, the philosophy of Hegel, and the intersection of these lines of thought with cinema. He's published countless numbers of really important monographs that have sort of that I can assure you, Todd, have been cited on this podcast numerous times, not least The Real Gaze, film after Lacan, but as well as things like The Impossible David Lynch, The Fictional Christopher Nolan, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a second, and other books on Spike Lee, Rules of the Game, and comedy. Todd, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a real privilege to be here. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Chris.
No, it's our privilege. Todd, so I think to start things off, before we jump into Inception itself, I just wanted to ask you a question about fantasy, because I'm aware that listeners have a certain definition of fantasy that perhaps Chris and I have provided, and that definition often changes depending on the episode. Sometimes we talk about fantasy in terms of genre, and sometimes we're talking about fantasy in terms of a sort of, process by which spectators create meaning. Other times we're talking about something that's represented on screen as an act of fantasizing. So I just wondered how you engage with the term fantasy in your work, and perhaps how that links to your interest in the filmmaking of Chris Nolan.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. I think that it does. It's one of those terms that has this floating signification to it, I think. And so I think most people, when they think of fantasy, think of it as a genre. I almost never talk about it as a genre. So I almost always think about it as a way to create a scenario or a scene through which I can work out my desire. So I'm using it in a singular way, but I think it also works collectively, culturally. Like, I think what Hollywood does, or what any cinematic universe does, is it creates a fantasy world that people, and I always think of the trailer as a insight into the fantasy that the film is going to create. And then the trailer says to you, do you like that? Do you want to participate in this fantasy, or do you not? And then if you like the trailer, then you buy into the fantasy, or at least you buy a ticket to get into the fantasy. So I really think of the filmic world itself largely as a fantasy structure on its own. And then I think there are certain filmmakers that are more invested in the fantasy dimension of cinema. That is, that they're more invested in the way that the film can actually show us a stage where our desire gets realized, versus others where there's more of a frustration of what we desire. And so we're constantly coming up against very clear obstacles. And I think Nolan's pretty interesting because he does both things. Like, there are obstacles and there are films that really emphasize the obstacle. And then there are films where, and often it's the same film where we get a kind of realization of desire that it would be impossible in real life. So I think that for me, fantasy is this stage where we can find a path to our desire, a path that, is blocked often, but it's nonetheless a path that's workable or visible for us.
Yeah, I mean, Nolan is somebody who, obviously, we're sort of recording this in the I guess the slipstream of his latest film, Tenet, and obviously he's obviously an incredibly sort of divisive figure because of exactly that sort of that puzzling nature and the idea of narrative itself becoming spectacle. I mean, do you think he's somebody who sort of stands out within a kind of a contemporary Hollywood filmmaking context as someone who is particularly interested in these kinds of things? He loves the sort of mind game film, and he likes sort of these sort of multiple layers of embedding. And so, given that you've written on him and sort of had a scholarly interest in him, is that where your primary interest in him as a filmmaker sort of comes from? That exactly what he's trying to do with narrative and spectacle and the relationship between the two, and this idea of fantasy on top of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I view that my idea is that Nolan is kind of what Orson Welles would be if he hadn't been destroyed by the Hollywood. Like if he was alive, 40 years, 50 years later, like I think Nolan does a lot of the same things that Welles does, but Welles never got the opportunity really to have a lot of money other than the first film he made, to have a lot of money to make films. So I think my idea is that that's kind of what Nolan is, and he's working things out. And I think what you say, like this relationship between narrative and spectacle, I think it's so important in the way Nolan structures his films, right? I think in many ways, I think that's the key idea. Like, how does that relationship work itself out? And then some films are more about the narrative, and then some films are more about the spectacle. And the one we're talking about today really is marries both together in such maybe more than any of them.
I guess what is interesting about Inception is that there are lots of sort of narratives surrounding the movie, and that one of them is a sort of industrial narrative about the sort of unique status Nolan has, right, in that he's able to make a film like this that costs the amount it does, that has the level of VFX and spectacle that we're talking about, and has a certain grammar to it, or certain visual grammar to it that is very much part of the mechanics and economics of Hollywood filmmaking today. But within that is very interested in narrative experimentation, in narratological experimentation, I guess, and that makes him quite unique through various reasons, surrounding his career. So I wondered how you came to Inception as sort of a bit of academic interest. Was it Inception that sort of brought you into Nolan? Were you already interested in Nolan before the film came along? What was your backstory with the movie itself that sort of kickstarted this interest?
Yeah, I was interested in Nolan before. So the film for me, the first Nolan film I saw was Memento. I saw it in the theater, and I thought it was stunningly good. But it really, I have to say, it was really prestige when I first thought, wow, there's a guy who makes consistently these films that are pretty amazing. And I still think Prestige is the top one for me. So that's what I would say. I remember exactly where I was when I saw Prestige. I was traveling, and I remember the theater. And I remember turning to my spouse, who's also a film theorist, and I said, he's pretty great. Like that's the first thing we said to each other. He's pretty great. And so, yeah. And I think there's a way in which Inception develops the most this, like, it's so narratively complex, right? But the spectacle of it is also as stunning as any of his films. So I think in a certain way, it's the high point of both of those dimensions of his filmmaking. So I know there are people that are disappointed by it, and especially because I'm friends with a lot of psychoanalytic critics, and they, like, Slavoj Žižek doesn't like it, and part of the thing that drives a lot of people crazy, my friends, is the use of the term subconscious all the time by the Leonardo DiCaprio character, by Cobb. So I don't know. So I try to include that in my reading and make that part of the way he's misguided, and as if Nolan kind of understood that. Although so that made me feel like I had to be creative, but I feel like the film is stunning for the way it brings, just like I was saying, and we were saying, like, those two things together.
Yeah, I mean, it's one that I mean, great to hear about the Prestige, which I also I think is absolutely kind of fabulous, and because it's about the power of illusion and belief and all these things all these threads that Nolan ultimately kind of plays with something like Inception and the film's tagline, the what is it, something about the dream is reality or something like that. The dream is real. But I mean, he's sort of, I think he's striking for me, and Inception is particularly striking in terms of the sort of idea of narrative and narrative formula, and formulas being these fixed, stable, closed systems, and how the film perhaps, I think, connects up to sort of more contemporary iterations of something like the puzzle film. As I said, the narrative becoming spectacle, these kind of convoluted narrative or series of narrative premises. You've got writing by Thomas L. Sasser on the Mind Game film. There's something sort of retrospective, retroactive. The past is formed in the present rediscovers the past, reshaping the future. Movies that play games with character, with audience. All of these things, this sort of maze-like kind of quality to the diegesis, and the idea of diegesis as truth. The fact that the diegesis and both the world of the film, the story in which is taking place in the world, are sort of enigmatic, and I really love that about the film, and sort of and kind of, I guess, placing special effects and digital technology within that. I think, as I said, a lot of the certainly writing on the film in relation to its visual effects, in relation to I guess the science fiction genre more broadly, stuff around how the film is sort of an allegory of filmmaking as a process, the power of illusion, and so forth. But there's something really kind of cleverly plotted in both time and narrative. Its use of time, its use of narrative, its use of the kind of diegetic layers. I think it's kind of really fascinating as a work of sort of science fiction, and yet at the same time is also really understated. Alex talked about the industrial narratives and Nolan's place within sort of visual effects, and one of the reasons that The Prestige is so useful, because it's sort of about the mechanics of how to do things by hand, which is obviously exactly what Nolan's about. You never really see, what is it, the dead bird in the cage. That's the thing but actually it's sort of quite dirty. A lot of his effects aren't, I mean, they're fantastic, and the CGI and digital technology is sort of present in the film, and there is this real myth around his use of digital effects, which he does use, but a lot of the industrial narratives about how he's kind of working things out. He is a filmmaker who does what his films do, and also does what The Spectator has to do, kind of work out problems, work things out, and put them on screen. So that's what I really like about both Inception as a film, but also exactly what Alex is saying, those sorts of industrial narratives that seem to circle around the film and Nolan as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that the notion of like the way that the narrative is told, I think he really gets something about that. And I think you mentioned retroactivity, and I think, Tenet obviously is really explicitly about that, but so is Memento, and so is Inception. Like, the idea is like you get to the end, and then that's where we have to think about narratives as told from the end back to the beginning. And that's how we would properly understand them. And that, Freud has this term Nachträglichkeit, which basically means retroactivity or going like belatedness. And so this idea that I think Nolan is in many ways the filmmaker of that idea, that you think about the narrative from the end, and then the beginning that almost doesn't even matter, because the beginning gets constituted only through the end. And I think that really, it's interesting to think about that relative to the way that effects work, right? Like, because that's about narrative. But then if you're thinking about narrative in that way, then I think the effects end up being these moments that are constituted through that retroactivity, and something comes out through the effect. I think like there's a moment, like we get these moments where something, like we get an encounter that we didn't anticipate, but it only becomes clear because we're going backwards through the narrative. And I feel like obviously Memento makes that clear, but I think it's also clear in Inception, so I really like that way. Like, you plant the right thing, and then everything up to that, it's like as if everything's been leading up to that point. So then everything is shifted by what gets planted. And I think it's also true, the very end of the film, everything shifts by how you relate to that, the spinning of I remember being in the audience, and it was amazing. Like, everyone was so upset. Like, you could feel the entire cinema just, people were like, oh my, and people were shouting things. And in America, that's not a common thing. People don't shout at the cinema usually. typically. So it really upset people, and then it obviously caused a lot of speculation. But I think that is that ending. Then, so I like what you're saying, Chris, that what the narrative is doing internally, the film is also doing to the spectator.
Yeah. But I suppose also that the idea of effects, actually, while you're talking, I mean, I've got about 50,000 things based on now what you said, and I will defer to Alex imminently. But actually, the labour of visual effects, that the visual effects are something that are added in after the fact anyway. They're sort of visual effects are fundamentally posthumous because they kind of come in after the sort of film has ended, if you like. So we're always seeing in visual effects shots a kind of combination of time. We're seeing production and post-production, and so there's sort of something that I don't quite know, but there's something in the way we're always seeing split temporalities. We're always seeing beginnings and endings in every sort of visual effect shot in lots and lots of ways, which is not a great way to sort of say it, but there's something about shifting temporalities in visual effect shots, so that the special effects are as much about the spectacle as we see it as much as the sort of the spectacle of time as it is being layered on top of these blue screen or whatever kind of effect it might be. But exciting.
Right.
Well, it occurs to me also that when we talk to VFX practitioners, that the act they do is very retrospective in that they get given an end goal by their production house. We've just recorded an episode talking about Captain Marvel, where we're talking about making of the photorealistic cat throughout the movie, but make a photorealistic cat, and then the labour process is this gradual actualization of the end goal, right? Which I guess is a creative thing anyway. Yeah, you want to get to here. How do I get there? But the films, what makes Nolan's interesting is that there's a certain, what he's managed to do is create a very appealing, in terms of mass appeal aesthetic out of confusion or bewilderment or befuddlement or whatever the right phrase is, where part of the pleasure of watching these movies is waiting for the moment that the Rubik's Cube clicks and all the sides are the same colour, right? It's waiting for that moment where, okay, this will all make sense at this moment, and there's a pleasure in things making sense that, is part of all narrative theory and all narrative pleasure, but there's something odd about the delight in the struggle of it all. Yeah, there's the films are quite referential about this. There's the Tom Hardy character that constantly keeps going like, so hang on a minute, well, how's this all work? And am I keeping up? And like, obviously that's a gag at the spectator who might be struggling, who is sort of gleefully struggling to keep up. And the film is gleefully complicated. All these layers of dreams. There's a certain point in it where I can remember watching it for the first time where the audience just starts laughing, and not at the film, but kind of with the film, because there's just like, oh, now the only solution to this is we have to go into an even deeper level, right? So there's something about playing with the spectator and asking them to, go with me on this journey. There's this level of trust being offered because Nolan's such a publicly well-known filmmaker, but also, don't worry, I will confuse you, but it won't ever get too much, or I won't ever take you to the point where it's really kind of, avant-garde and meaning becomes a lot more sort of, subjective and formless and all this kind of stuff. And I'm always interested in the sort of what you think the politics of all that are, Todd, because like there's a certain, a lot of what your work does so well is sort of blend the political and the aesthetic really nicely. Right. So I wondered what your thoughts were on what's politically going on there in this sort of mass enjoyment in these films that are joyfully difficult to understand, with the sort of tacit acknowledgement that you will understand them eventually, right?
Yeah, I think that's the political complication. I'm fascinated by what you said, this tacit acknowledgement that you will eventually understand. And I think, that's what, for me, I think the politically more radical films are never giving you that, right? Or you get it in such a way that it's going to fundamentally alter the way that you think about things, because it comes as such a, I think this is true in Lynch, you get what you were thinking you wanted, but then you find out you didn't want it at all, right? That's what's so great about Lynch's films. He understands the way in which your unconscious desire actually is aiming at something that you consciously aren't sure that you're after. But I think that what you're suggesting, that in the case of Nolan, that's not true, that there is this, maybe that there's this pact that kind of dulls that political edge of his cinema. Although I don't know about that. I mean, like I do. I mean, because like think about. I mean, Inception is interesting, right? Because it doesn't. Like maybe there's a pack that you're going to get some that's all going to hold together, but then in the end, does it? Like I think there's a way in which that the ending kind of does what I just said Lynch does. Like he gives you that answer, and it's not really like I think back about that audience reaction to the film, like they weren't happy with the answer that they got. So to me, that's the key to a politically more emancipatory or radical film is that it doesn't give you the answer that it sets up a question or a problem, and it doesn't give you the answer that seems evident that you desire, you consciously think you want. Instead, it gives you what corresponds to an unconscious desire that's actually laid out. And I think Nolan does that. And I think Memento does it. I think with that ending in Memento where you get this that everything you want the answer, and then what you get is, oh well, the answer is just that he's told this lie to himself that in order to give himself something to do, basically. And then in Inception, I think the ending does not really give you a clear sense of, and we were joking about this at the beginning. Am I awake or is this a dream? And I think the ending of the film doesn't allow you to distinguish between that. And then I think Nolan's point is the inability to distinguish is really the answer, that there's something counts more about the dream logic and our investment in it than it does about real life. And that's where I think the real politics of his filmmaking lies.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma because you're right. Actually, that's a simplification because it ends with a question rather than an answer. Some of his movies, I think of something like Dunkirk, where certainly the narrative ambiguity does slot into a certain it was this, this, and this, but that's not true of Inception. It ends on the will the totem fall over or not, and therefore is it a dream or is it not a dream? Spoiler alert, but we're 20 minutes in. Everyone, watch the movie. It's an interesting question, but I'm interested in what the ramifications are in terms of what either of those questions means, because I'm not quite sure I always understand what's at stake for Nolan or for the audience in asking that question. So why does it matter if the totem falls down? We could argue philosophically it matters because it's right back to sort of it's the Descartesian problem, right? Of are we dreaming? Are we awake? What does those two things look like? What is reality? Is it a subjective or objective truth? Big questions. But I'm not quite sure what the film posits. And to me, actually, what is interesting about Inception is the idea is if the film asks you to think, is it a dream or is it not? That seems an almost very simple question out of quite a complicated film that is almost not the fact what Inception has to say about dreams, to me at least, is the least interesting aspect of the movie. What's much more interesting is what it has to say about the role of fantasy, the role of memory, and the relationship between those two things and filmmaking, which we've sort of alluded to thus far. So I wonder what question it's asking us to really consider, and what the political ramifications of either answer are in the universe of Nolan.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Alex. I mean, my sense is that it doesn't matter at all. Like my claim is that that's a fausse piste, like a false clue, like that we shouldn't be looking at like the top is really there. And it's interesting. I mean, I think there is even a clue in the film that we can't trust because Cobb does say you can't only your own. If the totem is from someone else, it doesn't tell you anything. And he then clearly says this is the totem from Mal that I have, right? So he has already said that we shouldn't trust whether the totem whether this works or not. So I really feel like that's a way in which the film is saying, look over here, like in The Prestige, like look over here so that you don't see over here where the real question is, which I think is like what the dream tells us. And I agree that the dream itself, it's not really concerned with that, but it's concerned with how we invest ourselves in it, or what memories we invest ourselves in. And that's where the real struggle is, what really counts is. And it's not in this question of like what's real or what's not real. And I think that's true in all of Nolan's work, right? He cares about the revelatory power of the fiction. I mean, that's why I called my book The Fictional Christopher Nolan, because I think he thinks like these narratives that we invest ourselves in, that's where we really reveal like what we are, the real of our own, the way we fantasize, the way we desire, the way we enjoy. So I think that for him is the real question, and the question is not whether, oh, is this fake or is it real?
I think I wrote down as you were talking that idea of the power of the revelation, and I was thinking about I was thinking about readerly texts and writerly texts and tradition and modernity, and I was thinking about sort of Nolan's interested in types of deception. So exactly as you're saying, it's he's interested in, he's a filmmaker who's interested in the building, in this case, the building of fictional worlds and the convincing construction of fictional worlds. But sort of types of deceptions, you have deceptions on a narrative level between characters. The film also, I made a couple of notes as I was watching it, that the film itself has sort of false memories, because there are scenes, and lots of films do this in terms of replaying scenes. I think this is why, if we think about the genre of the film, which is both a science fiction film and a heist film and like a mystery film, and the sort of replaying of scenes and sequences from a new angle. So the film itself has false memories, and there are bits where the film shows us things. Fight Club's a good example. Memento also is a good example. It shows us scenes and then shows us the same scenes again. And so the film is lying to us. It is populated with unreliable narrators. And so the moment towards the end of the film where you sort of... and I suppose typically for this podcast we sort of started at the end, which is perfect in this case. Start, the end of the film. But towards the end of the film where the relationship, the full extent of the relationship between Cobb and Mal is coming out, and you see a scene replayed where it's not the younger version of DiCaprio and Marion Cotillard. It's they're all sort of older versions. They've already lived through this life once, and you see them as an old couple. And the film is sort of playing with that. It sort of shows you a scene where they're lying with their heads on the railway lines, and then it shows you again both as young and as old. And I quite like the idea that it's all in the mind. The film itself has these false memories, but it's also interested in kind of partial answers, and that's maybe where the power of the ending. For me, it does wobble because of the soundtrack, but I think, as Nolan himself has spoken about, that it's important that Cobb's not even looking. So it's not that it wobbles or whether it does or whether it doesn't. It's that Cobb's not looking. He's not interested in that because he's looking at this image of his children. So this idea of kind of partial answers, we get partial answers, which presumably only increases our desire for that full revelation. We're getting the fraction or the fragment rather than the full confession, I guess. And then also it suspends answers. It sort of prevents or halts disclosure, because at the end of the film it cuts off. So despite a form of revelation, it cuts us off at the end. So all of these things, Barthes is writing on readerly and writerly texts, and the role of sort of types of deception and what a text can do to us, I think, is in exactly what you're saying about Nolan's interested in both the dream logic but also this kind of revelatory power of illusion, which again makes the Prestige a kind of perfect analogy in lots of ways. We enjoy the kind of, not the thrill of the chase, but the thrill of the reveal.
It is interesting. I mean, I come back to what you said earlier, Alex, about the way we have this promise implicit in the Nolan film, and that's what makes people like it. But I mean, just the way, Chris, you were describing it, it is sort of curious how he's managed to be successful, right? Like he does. Like, I think there is this pact with the audience, but then it's violated in all these ways, especially in Inception, and yet people really still love his films, and I think a lot of that is the spectacle. It's almost like the narrative is this way in which I'm going to challenge what the audience consciously wants, and then the spectacle is the way in which I'm going to give them what they want. Like that, I just think of that scene in Inception where we get the streets of Paris folded back on top of each other. It's just enjoyable. Like, however that fits in the narrative, it's just really enjoyable to watch that. And I feel like that's part of the way in which he's paying off the spectator for this other. I'm going to thwart your desire on the one hand, but I'm going to grant you what you want on the other hand. I wonder if that dynamic isn't crucial to what he's doing, and you can maybe think of that in terms of narrative and spectacle, but maybe that's too simple.
There is something interesting, and I'm going to muddle it, but I know Eilish Wood has written something on Inception's timespaces and talks about the narrative is so complex in terms of its layering, and it's sort of it's not quite forking paths in the way that I guess narratologists might understand, but it's all about that loop, and even I think he writes on a piece of paper that loop between creating and perceiving our world and the dream and as reality, and you have lines like "follow you into your fantasy" and "come back to reality, Dom," and all these kinds of things. And actually, the visual effects in the film are pretty sort of, I don't want to say telegraphed, but kind of straightforward and clear cut. So the corridor is revolving and Paris is folding in on itself. There's something quite, I don't want to say simplistic, but sort of something quite, I don't know, easy. Maybe it's because it's so explicitly out there that the visual effect is being presented to you in a way that is so obvious and so sort of set-piecey that full disclosure of the effect is something, and also that the film presents it as an effect. You have the sort of the classic surrogate spectators. You have Dom and Ariadne looking at Paris as it folds over. Yes, so there's something quite explicit and exhibitionist and presentational about the way that the film is visualizing those kinds of effects. They are effects in the film and effects for us as we watch the film and so forth. And that leaves space for the narrative to be as complex as it is. And so there is, and I, as I said, I've kind of butchered what she's saying, but there is something quite sort of clear cut about the effects on show, that they're not hidden, they are explicit and revealed to us in a way that the narrative never quite reveals its hand.
Well, just to add to that, the Paris sequence, which I agree is like if you have to only watch 3 minutes of this movie, it's that. But it's there's the prologue to it within that individual sequence is the conversation the two of them have. Sorry, Tom. One of the features of this podcast is that I don't remember any characters' names in any films I've ever seen ever. But the two characters, Leonardo DiCaprio and Elliot Page, of course, and they're having a conversation. In the film, about and he says to her, how do we get here? Do you remember? And they have a kind of back and forth about, no, I don't remember the beginning of this conversation. And of course, we don't remember the beginning of the conversation either, because we've been thrust into it halfway through, because we as spectators have been playing with a film grammar that's very happy to dump us. That happens in... How many times does that happen in a film? It happens all the time. You get dumped into the middle of a conversation and your sort of brain fills in what you did before, what must have been said up until this point, and then you jump straight back in and off you go. And so it's interesting that line of dialogue where the film is kind of inviting you to see that, yes, they are in a dream, they are recognizing in their dream, but what we are watching as you point out, Todd, is extra fictional. Is fiction declaring itself to be fiction, which is that is what fantasy is. Both as a genre and as a sort of storytelling trope. It's fiction that I think it's Atterbury who says that fantasy is extra fictional or declares its fictionalness rather than tries to disguise its fictionalness. So they have two characters basically telling you, that thing you're doing right now, we're doing it too, and it's weird, isn't it? And then Paris folds in on itself. And I'm interested in the dialogue between the narrative and the spectacle, because the spectacle is obviously experientially doing this incredible, wow, you'd never see this in real life. But of course you'd never see it in real life. This isn't real life. It just told you it wasn't, 2 seconds ago before it even happened. So I don't know what the visuals do in relationship to the narrative, but there's certainly a very tricksy back and forth going on in that. And I can't, it's Todd, you take it away.
No, it's great. It's such a great observation. And I think, isn't it funny too that the visuals don't feel the need to be realistic, right? I think the spectacle, clearly we would never see Paris folding in on itself. Clearly in Interstellar, we would never see, I just remember that baseball field from Interstellar. It's such an unrealistic and yet completely believable mise en scène, and I feel like that's the key. He wants to create worlds that are not realistic but are believable, and I think that's this idea of the fiction that you can invest yourself in. And so he's trying to create a world where you can invest yourself in. And I wonder if that's maybe the answer to that question of why he's so popular given the complexity. And I think it's because he creates a world that masses can invest themselves in, and that's the thing. And so you can believe in it even while knowing it's not real. And I think that's really a crucial distinction. That what is the status of our belief, right? And that's
So to add to the question, let's add a few substreams of meaning down the layers to that final question. One question it asks us at the end is this a dream or is it not a dream? But which I think is, but I think almost another question the film is asking you is: Are you going to engage with that question when you walk out of the cinema, or are you going to engage in the bigger question, which is that it doesn't matter because even if it is a dream or even if it is not a dream, in both cases it's still fictional. Yeah,
Right.
because why does it matter if it's a dream or not? It's still, none of these characters are real. None of these things actually happened. So it doesn't, why invest so much? Does it matter that it was all a dream? Because it was all a dream in the sort of, if we take the Wizard of Oz, cinema as dream kind of metaphor, and I guess what I'm interested in, this is probably more of a reception issue than a formal issue, because I think the film perfectly invites both of those considerations, is that I think what Nolan successfully manages to do is that, to be blunt, I suspect 80-90% of audiences primarily engage with that first question, but the film allows for enough opportunities to allow people to engage with that second question at the same time. It's almost the totem is a red herring, yeah, as you were saying.
Yeah,
because it doesn't matter.
Yeah, Alex, I think that's a great point, and I think that the way that he gets you, because if the social reality that we experience is also fictional, right? and it matters because of the way we invest ourselves in it. And I think and I think even about that reality, the question of what's real and what's not real is not really ever the question. It's what are you invested in? Which fictions count for you? And I think to create that shift, I think this film is great on that question, right? I think it's his best film on the question of should we relate to this, the fiction as a fiction, and then not count it as less because we understand that it's fictional. And I think that's really the key. So there's a way in which he's saying, look, the experience of films is more important perhaps than the experience of real life. And it's interesting that you brought up Wizard of Oz, because people, when they remember Wizard of Oz, they remember the fictional color part. The other part, it's like, okay, it's fine, but it's not like, oh, what's the real in that film? That doesn't really matter. What matters is what Dorothy gets to explore when she's in Oz.
Completely agree with you, Todd, which is why anyone that says that The Wizard of Oz is a conservative movie hasn't seen it, because it might be on the page, but on the screen it's a fundamentally radical experience, because it basically, experientially says Kansas is grey, dull, and boring, and basically exists as in reality as a perfunctory wraparound device to get us in and out of the theatre, and the real fun to be had is in dream and fantasy and the Yellow Brick Road. So yeah. But I have a contractual obligation to mention the Wizard of Oz in every single episode of this podcast, and I've just fulfilled that. So perhaps we won't delve too much down that particular slipstream. Hi everybody. If you'll permit me to pause the podcast just for a second, I'd like to ask a favour. These podcasts are completely run on Chris and I's spare time between our academic jobs, and they are free for you to download, free for you to consume, and hopefully to learn from. That's why we do it. That's why we're interested in recording it. However, we could do with your help to make the programme more visible and to make sure as many people are accessing it as possible. Whatever podcast subscription service you've downloaded this from, if you could quickly give us a like, a subscribe, and a review if the formatting will allow you, that will allow us to increase our visibility on that platform, ensuring we get more listeners and we're able to spread the word about fantasy animation to more and more people. We're delighted by the response the podcasts are receiving so far. We're really privileged to have the audience we do so far, but the more the merrier. Please help us make that possible. Otherwise, please do enjoy the conversations that follow, and the more conversations that will follow in the episodes to come. Chris, how does VFX play in all this? Because that's the big question. I mean, the impossible question. But what is because part of all of this, therefore, is that part of the asserting of fictionality is the assertion of CGI over live action as well. And you've alluded to Nolan's relationship to that in the past, because he's quite often seen as a filmmaker that sort of is a champion for practical filmmaking, right? But his films don't necessarily bear that out, or the film doesn't necessarily bear that out.
No, I mean, it's funny because actually what it seems to what I want to do on this podcast is in fact not talk about animation at all. I've moved over to the fantasy side. You can do animation here and Alex. And I think actually the key thing is when Todd was talking about what counts, or which fictions count for you, because, and you're right with the sort of Wizard of Oz, it's about whichever place feels like home. Not reality, it's whichever feels like home, wherever you feel like most at home. But I was thinking about kind of fictional world theory and the way in which we define fictional spaces, and the Skyfall, a Bond movie, is as fictional as How to Train Your Dragon. Their fictionality is defined in different ways. One is through, like, James Bond doesn't exist in my world, but Daniel Craig does, and equally the fictionality of How to Train Your Dragon is through both, you know, the presence of dragons, but also the ontology of its animatedness. And so I'm really interested in sort of fictional world theory and how, and the relationship is supposed to be fantasy fiction and historical fiction, but actually they're both fictional, and the difference is a degree rather than of kind. What's more interesting in film studies is not necessarily what we escape from, but what we escape into. This is what people writing on fictional worlds are kind of interested in. So I absolutely agree with that. And actually, what the film posits, perhaps through its special effects, is that the special effects in the film, or the explicitly marked sequences that are designed to be understood as effects, only exist in the dream world. So the Paris folding over and the exploding sort of books and fruit and all that sort of stuff, they are used by the film to show us that this is a dream world, because visual effects don't happen in the real world. They only happen in these sorts of sub layers. But actually, presumably at the level of industry, visual effects happen on all the layers. We just don't see them. And so there is something really interesting about how the film, and I think this is what Wood's talking about in why Inception is a good film to use to think about what effects do and what we expect, and perhaps to sort of to speak the language of fantasy, what we desire, what do we want from special effects? Well, we want them to be special, and if we want them to be special, we want to be able to know that they're special, or to at least see them. And so perhaps that's why the film relegates its use of effects, or its explicit use of effects, to worlds that we know are dreams, because it allows what it allows Nolan to do is actually use setting, but also use effects to, perhaps in his own mind, figure out the order of play, where things go, and we know. I think that's what I mean about the special effects actually giving a sense of coherency, perhaps. But you're absolutely right. In answer to your original question, Alex, yeah, he goes for material ones. But no, he's very, a lot of the stuff. I mean, the famous rotating corridor sequence, I think, was sort of supervised by Chris Corbould, who obviously, as you well know, is a name familiar from the Bond franchise, but the sort of, which obviously themselves have a really interesting relationship to the materiality of sort of special effects and miniatures and models, as opposed to digital technology, perhaps. But no, Nolan certainly has an industrial relationship to doing things in camera. But actually, a lot of stuff written on Inception, you know, double negatives work on the film, how they created sort of limbo city, if you like, and the falling buildings, the ends of the earth sort of aesthetic, and how this CGI is a fundamental element of the production of the film. But I think from a spectatorial point of view, it's perhaps used invisibly, or used in a way that we don't see the effects in the real world, because that's not how the film chooses to define that world for us. It relegates or allocates, perhaps is a better way of putting it, the visibility of its digital effects to the dream spaces, because that's the slow motion of the car, perhaps the van falling off of the bridge in the slow motion rain, all of that sort of stuff. It's used for, I think effects are being used in service of coherency, and effects being used in service of the coherency of the fictional world, and for us as spectators to make sense of those sorts of different layers. A very convoluted answer to a very simple question.
No, I like that. I wonder about that. I mean, I like that link between the effect and the coherence, and I wonder if how you would think about that. Like, it's almost like narrative drives Nolan to incoherence, and then the effect ends up sealing it back into recreating the coherence of the world. And I hadn't thought so much until just now about this relationship between narrative and effect, but I think that really it does. I just think about the way in which his use of effects is so particular. I think, especially I think of the superhero films, because it's so different. And there, I think, that's probably why he has the reputation for the practical effect, because he doesn't like, it's not like a Marvel film when you're watching Dark Knight or Dark Knight Rises or even Batman Begins. And I think that again, there's something about believability, and I think, and that's why the idea of coherence and believability, maybe like that Nolan doesn't want to give up on that notion, that idea that we should believe in the world that we're seeing, and that because our belief in it is the thing, is actually the nature of it. Like, it only exists insofar as we believe in it. And I feel like that's maybe one of the real central ideas for him, and that's why the effects have to do what you said they do, Chris, is create that coherence. If we lacked that, then I think maybe the world would fall apart.
Yeah, which it all fold in on itself.
Right,
yes.
right.
Yeah, well, exactly. Or they have to be used to deliberately allow for moments of incoherence. So if you think about the Paris folding in on itself, that is a moment where the film is saying, this is fictional. It helps support what isn't fictional in the movie, but this is fictional. And the use of VFX, a very obvious moment of VFX in that sequence, helps to support that as sort of at a material level. It's interesting because it links to a work that Scott Ben Tyra has been doing, riffing on your work, Todd, about sort of in a very great collection called Fantasy Animation: Connections Between Medias, Genres, available all very good bookstores around the world, I'm sure, but at an affordable price. But we move on from the plug to the fact that he talks about sort of, he uses your categories of sort of this fantasy of desire and the cinema of desire and cinema of fantasy, and the idea that some cinema sort of integrates fantasy and desire, which tend to be the more politically conservative movies, and some offer a sort of disintegrated vision of fantasy and desire, and that allows for sort of further thought and discourse and a lack of believability in a structure or system. And he sort of applies that to VFX work, actually, in Game of Thrones. But he's talking about that, like, the idea of a believable effect actually rests quite a lot on an image that is integrated between levels of what we might call fantasy, if you will, the VFX, and the desire for something to be, real, based in sort of photorealistic grammar. And so an integrated image, an integrated special effect image, is one that looks real because it integrates those two things succinctly, and it looks like we're in a real space, even though they might have painted out some skyscrapers in the background or a crowd, or put a crowd in, or all the things that they do, that Nolan does all throughout this movie, but we don't necessarily recognize as special effects. And then the special effects, or what therefore that implies, which Ben, bless him, in 5,000 words didn't quite get to because he's busy talking about a Game of Thrones, but what that implies is there could be such a thing as a disintegrated image, where that phantasmic supplement, the VFX supplement, is allowed to be disintegrated from the structure of which it's sort of engaging with. And perhaps what we get in Paris is exactly that, an explosion of phantasma on screen, which as you say in your book, kind of actually highlights the vacuity or the illusionness of all this, where like a fantasy without a structure or a desiring structure to support it is just a fantasy and therefore has no power. So perhaps what Nolan's doing with VFX is he isn't not using VFX. He uses them when he wants things to look, guess for a better word, fake on screen. Yeah. And he's playing that out in his, move from one technology to another.
Yeah, I love that idea, Alex, that it's the moment of obvious fakeness. And it's interesting, like, I think you're right. Like, it does, rather than creating an integrated world, it's precisely what causes this moment of disintegration, where the coherence, I think that's right, that the coherence of the fantasy world actually marks the incoherence of the rest of the filmic world, right? Like, I think that's really great, that there's and I think that's true, that Nolan doesn't really fit. He doesn't you don't come out of Nolan's films feeling perfectly integrated as a subject within the social order, right? In fact, you feel the opposite. You feel precisely this moment of disintegration. I remember when I walked out of Memento, I was like, what can I even rely on? Like, I didn't feel like I could rely on the truth of anything. And I feel like that in Inception, you walk out with this, like, what really counts for me? And I think that's, like, if you can get people to ask those kinds of questions, I count that as a radical. That's what the aesthetic at its most radical does. Like, it causes these things that you would take for certain to be questionable.
Yeah.
And somehow makes them entertaining. That's the really bizarre aspect of Nolan, is that most times that happens if you think of someone like Lynch, or if you think of some, the sort of, art house traditions or things like that, usually that kind of question, I guess it is entertaining in a sort of, class-based, appreciative system whereby, like, the art house part of what's entertaining about it is that to be a good socialist, you need to go to the art house every week, have a expensive cup of coffee, and discuss the issues afterwards, right? So there is a certain entertainment that we shouldn't discount in all that sort of stuff. But the idea of doing that on a sort of mass appeal level at the sort of the address of the blockbuster to do it, and to make people feel like that's Friday night entertainment is remarkable in terms of the bringing together of lots of different worlds and audiences there.
It is. I'm going to overstate. This is too generous to Nolan, I think, but it's like what Shakespeare was able to do, right? Like he appeals to he was trying to create popular plays, right? And yet there are plays that, like just have this amazing kind of theoretical, philosophical, political content to them. So I wouldn't put Nolan at the level of Shakespeare, but I do think that he's trying to do a similar thing. Like, how can I make this complexity digestible, right? Like I think that's what he's trying to do. And that I really appreciate that. Like, I think that is, and I have an appreciation for Jean-Luc Godard and, that whole tradition. Like, I think Last Year at Marienbad is maybe one of the greatest movies ever made, but I still feel like there's a limitation to that. Just what you're saying, like it just can't. There's no way everyone can go to Last Year at Marienbad and find it engaging. But everyone could go to Inception and feel engaged with it. So I think that there is really something to be said for that.
Yeah, as you were writing, I was trying to make an analogy, or thinking about the analogy to The Prestige, and whether we are Christian Bale, and this is going to be spoilerific, whether we're Christian Bale, whether we're Hugh Jackman, because The Prestige, in the case of Christian Bale, we have this strange set of occurrences that we find out is relatively boring, and spoiler alert, there are twins, they're brothers, they're twins, and so forth. So you have this strange occurrence, and then the revelation is relatively sort of mundane. And then the opposite is true of Hugh Jackman, that you have this sort of event that seems teleportation. We've sort of seen that within the world of the film, and then the revelation is actually spectacular, that actually it becomes this. And you mentioned about the coherency of fantasy, and I'm trying to figure out whether Nolan is more like the Christian Bale narrative, or whether he's more like the Hugh Jackman narrative, that he sort of, the answer that he gives is sort of strange and fantastical, but it's got a level of coherency or digestibility, as you said, that you sort of like, yep, okay, so it's complex, but it's sort of digestible, complex fantasy, and so that's fine. It's less like boring twins and more like mechanical reproduction of the self, and so there was something quite nice about those two strands of The Prestige. If people have seen the film, if they haven't, you can cut the last sort of 3 or 4 minutes of what I just said. But about how Nolan chooses, and what he chooses to do with the reveal, because you said he's interested in the power of revelation, but it's like, what revelation is he giving, or is he not giving any revelation at all? And so I was just trying to think through that in relation to what those two characters in The Prestige do, whether the revelation is sort of mundane and domestic and unspectacular, or whether it's strange and fantastical but coherent enough.
I think it's mundane. I think that, although I'm tempted to answer it, Chris, by saying it maybe Nolan creates a chiasmus where you have both things operating at once in his filmmaking, just like he has both characters in The Prestige. But I think it's more that he's, and I have to say that I felt like the revelation that Tesla has actually created, it's a little bit, I didn't really love that about that. It's the only slight thing I don't love about The Prestige. And I feel like that's because it's a little bit against Nolan. I think Nolan's usually, it's like this incredible complexity, and then you realize that the thing that's Orion and everything is just a banal object. And I think that's why I made the allusion to Wells, and I think that's the idea of Citizen Kane, right? Like, everything is structured about, it's just the banality of the sled. There's this funny thing. This is not a Nolan joke. It's a Wells joke. But so Spielberg, I guess, asked Orson Welles if he could buy Rosebud and Wells said to him, "Didn't you see the movie? We burned it."
Mm.
So I think the idea that it's burned is the point. Like, it's just this thing that's just this crap that's just thrown away. And like the revelation that they're just twins, I think that's more Nolan's ballywick. Like, that's his, I'm going to give you this, but understand that what's at the heart of this whole complexity is this banality. And I think that's a really powerful political position to hold up.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The discrepancy in the film between spectacular technology, but also it's a film about parents and children and human imagination and the power of dreaming and guilt in the case of Cobb and his relationship to his wife. And so if you kind of strip back the narrative complexity, I mean, there's a few people kind of, I suppose writing about the film that actually say, well, actually it's relatively kind of standardized. You have goal-oriented storylines, you have a relatively happy if ambiguous ending, you have a degree of kind of logical resolution in some senses, you have kind of familiar patterns, you have the flashback as a standard device, so a lot of it is relatively simple, and yet and maybe that's it, is that at the core it's relatively simple, or it's banal, or whatever it is you want to call it, but he kind of does something in the showmanship of those things and those different elements and disparate elements and the layering of all the and intertwining of these different kind of relatively conventional, because all the layers are about we've got to get from here to here and get this, but it's the interweaving of those sort of relatively classical strands of narrative, out of which comes that kind of confusion. But actually it's relatively stable, and after a few times you sort of can get it. I mean, there are still little bits and bobs, but there is a degree of, as you say, a kind of digestibility to that complexity.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think so. What we would say is he's more on the side of the Christian Bale character in Prestige, and I think that's true. Although you did make a key point that there's the great end of Prestige where Hugh Jackman says, "You never understood. It's the look on their faces. Like it's something miraculous happens." And I think that Nolan does understand that in a way that the Christian Bale character didn't, right? Like he thinks like Hugh Jackman says, if you can fool them for a minute, then you've created something really special. And I think he's almost speaking directly for Nolan there. That he does understand the creative power of the aesthetic and the way that it can produce something and produce a kind of belief that isn't possible outside of it.
Yeah. And then I guess it's how I'm interested in then what audiences do with it, because I think the final thing to sort of to touch on with the movie is the sort of way the film offers this kind of metaphor of cinema and what it therefore wants us to consider in relation to that metaphor. I was struck again watching it this time that we have this sort of the explanation of the role of the architect or the dream architect as providing the structure which we fill in, or that the dreamers that fill in, and that part of is that you give them something that's incomplete, because it has to be incomplete so that they can then complete it themselves. So don't make the city entirely mappable, which is again, the metaphor with cinema is exactly there, right? No shot is ever complete, no set is ever complete. We stitch it together, we put it together. So I'm interested in what that's saying. Are we the architects? Is Nolan the architect in this movie? He's providing us a structure which he's encouraging us to fill in, and therefore encouraging us to think about actively the role of filling in that we're doing. Or are we providing a? I don't like. Is that too glib, or is that sort of roughly what you would take from the movie?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty good, Alex. I think that's right, and I think that what he wants us to do is, and I think you said it perfectly, pay attention to what's missing, and our act of filling it in, and the way we have to do that. And I think that's, I think most films don't put our attention onto what's missing, right? Like they want us to turn a blind eye to what's not there. And I think Inception is saying you have to look at what's not there and see the way in which what's not there is playing this crucial role in what's there. And I think that, I guess for me, that's one of the great aspects of the film, that we see what's not there as just as important as what's there. And that not this, I think you put it perfectly, like that you have to give a space that's empty in order for it to be believable. And I think that just goes so against what most people think about how cinema operates, that this, even the notion of, I remember like Avatar, like the idea that you could just immerse yourself totally in it without any empty spaces. And that was part of the appeal of it. And you would say like, I don't want you to bring you back from Pandora because you're just totally there, right? Like that. And I think Nolan is the opposite of that. And especially in this film, the way that what's just, as you were saying, like what isn't there counts for so much in creating the believability of it. And I think most of the time we don't think that. We don't think the blank spaces are crucial to our investment in something.
And I guess what's interesting about that, in terms of on an academic level, is that it links to what you do so well with your work, Todd. In that we have this notion, the sort of throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, certainly within the sort of psychoanalytic film theorist community, of cinema as interpolation, and cinema as the political act of cinema being almost what you said there about Avatar. What cinema does is place the spectator within a position where there's nothing left for them to add, because the film has already given everything to them. It has immersed them in a particular narrative, and therefore a particular ideological structure, and therefore a particular value system. And there's nothing left for the spectator as a living, breathing individual to bring to the film. But actually, the ideological power of cinema, but obviously of Inception, if we want to use a smaller example, is in the opportunities for gaps that it offers. I mean, to bring it back to my bread and butter, the opportunities to fantasize it offers, through its gaps, through its evocation of gaps and difference and its separation from life. So in a way, Inception is asking the spectator to go on a similar journey to what your work is doing, I guess.
That's very nice. I think that's right. I think, though, that you're right. The way you describe that trajectory is really good, right? That Nolan is not only challenging a whole kind of filmmaking, he's challenging a whole kind of way of theorizing about the cinema that says it's ideological because it creates a world of total presence, and that you're interpolated into that world. So this idea, it's borrowed from Louis Althusser, that film is ideological interpolation, just like you described. And I think that the way that he focuses on what's not there and what's missing and what the spectator has to do, I think it's completely challenged that idea of spectatorship, which you're right. I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to myself challenge that, for sure. Because I guess I've always felt like I've been more interested in the films that challenge what ideological interpolation than the films that just confirm it. And I feel like those films that challenge it are actually more engaging. And so I've always felt like that reducing the aesthetic to the ideological, I thought that seemed wrong to me, because the aesthetic, as I've always felt it, was the thing that always was challenging what I had been ideologically interpolated into. So I just had the complete opposite sense of what the aesthetic did.
In terms of the film's relationship to, you said about, Alex, this sort of metaphor of cinema and cinema's long-standing relationship to the mind and the brain, and how cinema is sort of thought-like because of the, I guess cinema and dreams and memory are based on images that signify. We have the idea of editing, that we're always sort of self-editing as part of our I guess subjectivity or whatever it is. But and similarly, the film is very, and cinema itself, I guess, is very kind of disruptively jumping from scene to scene. So I think you were mentioning earlier about how we got here. How did they get here? Well, cinema does this all the time, in the same way the brain edits what we see and so forth, and divides things into manageable chunks. I'm thinking of kind of the stream of consciousness. But what you were both saying relates again back to fictional worlds, and how, so when Victor Perkins writes, movies always take us into the middle of things because the film and its story begin, but the world does not. Characters have relevant histories. And then he talks about fictional worlds, and I think this taps into this sort of the off-screen and the blank space, which of course chimes with animation. You only need enough on the page to connote a world. And even in the case of video games, when characters move in digital video games and they move, the world builds in front of them. So it's sort of part of this generation. It's exactly what the film says about that relationship between creating and perceiving. And actually, Perkins says something similar with regards to fictional world. The camera's selectivity means that the framed image and the boundless fictional world create and account for one another. And that's exactly what the film is doing by creating a spectacle out of a world, a fictional world that can be creative and perceived at the same time, and what it means for us as spectators and the characters to intervene into that relationship. That kind of reciprocal relationship is something that at a narrative level, at the level of drama, they can enter into, and that's where the jeopardy and the narrative really, that's where the stuff is. But actually, it taps into what we enjoy about the cinema, that the camera only selects a certain thing. It makes no sense to ask of a painting what exists beyond the frame, but it makes perfect sense to ask of that of the cinema. The pleasure of blank space, of off-screen space, how the fictional world is connoted, not through visibility, through sound. Why do we believe that the world of Rear Window exists beyond everything else? That alleyway becomes really important down the side of the block of flats because stuff happens in that alleyway, and that's what happens in the alleyway is really interesting. We don't perceive it, and it's not really that important for us, but it at least tells us that the world is ticking by beyond the portion that we glimpse. And so all of that sort of believability and how that believability is cemented as part of our experience of fictional worlds, I think is something that really plays out and is interrogated by this sort of mind heist narrative of Inception. So I really like what the film is doing in relation to the believability and coherency of what it means to create a world, populate it, be interpolated into it, to live in it, to enjoy it, and then to leave it, I guess. And so yeah, I think what the film is doing reflexively about fictional worlds ties into cinema, certainly, but yeah, definitely got me thinking about what it means to build a world in something like animation, which is obviously of a different register,
Right.
but still relies on a spectatorial filling in the blank space to assume that there's an off screen and that sort of stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really one of the best films about the blank space, right? Like, it's really, I mean, it's funny because I think it's so crucial to the cinematic world in the way you described. Even that Rear Window example is really great. And but I think most films really try to create a world in which we don't see what's not there. And I think Nolan wants us to see what's not there. And I think that's a really rare thing in a mainstream blockbuster filmmaker like that. I think, just like Alex was talking about, there's a lot of art cinema filmmakers that do that really a lot. But I think Nolan is one of the few that is able to integrate that into a mainstream filmmaking.
The film is about an inception of a character, the Cillian Murphy character, who spends a majority of the movie thinking they're one level further up the dream than actually they are. Right in the Leonardo DiCaprio and his squad all know they are in a dream, and he doesn't know he's in a dream. Gets told he's in a dream, joins them down the layers, but doesn't know that the thing where he was told was a dream was also a dream. And actually, that's what the film is that the film is Leonardo DiCaprio and his squad, and we are Cillian Murphy. And what it wants us to do is come back up the layers, but all the way up to realise that the idea that the film's narrative is wanting to insert into the audience, insert into Cillian Murphy's character, is this is not real. That's the message they put into the character. It's just he doesn't realise that the message needs to come one level further up for him to actually have any power over the relationship. If he knew what they knew, that actually none of it is real, the question isn't what's a dream, what isn't. The question is the fictionality of just everyday existence as a concept. So that sort of sums up our thoughts on it. Do we have any final moments of the film we've not touched upon that we'd like to share? I'm aware we've sort of really only talked about like 4 minutes of it, but we've talked around it a lot. Or is there any final thoughts? So why don't we start with Chris, and then we'll let Todd sort of gather his thoughts, and then I can throw Chris under the bus and make him do it first.
That's fine.
So that he can summarise his thoughts on a complex movie quickly. In a succinct and logical fashion.
No, I mean, I've always been interested in puzzle films and these sorts of movies that play games that are about fiction, whether it's The Truman Show, whether it's Memento, all that sort of stuff. I've always been interested in I think plot twists sort of generally. And as I've been studying and teaching and writing about narrative and thinking about sort of transgressions and a tangling between the world of the telling and the world of the told, and people being able to enter into, hit cinema has a long history of this. It's characters walking into films. Was it Purple Rose of Cairo, or stepping out of film? So I've always been interested in those kinds of transgressions. And while the film doesn't, there aren't. I mean, it's doing the similar sort of thing, playing exactly what you're saying, those levels of fictionality and how we define levels of certain kinds of fictionality. But I think if you take each of the levels, they make absolute sort of, I guess, narrative sense, and there is a set of concrete characters and a goal that needs to be achieved, or a resolution, or something that needs to be solved. I'd never really thought about the film's ability to, through its editing practices, because film itself behaves like a brain, and it can move between different streams at various different points, and it's because of that perhaps the film is sort of one of the most careful and sort of pointed interrogations of the relationship, as one of the characters says, between what you know and what you believe, and the extent actually to which that matters. To go back to the final ending of the film truncates that final shot, and we assume it still happened, assume something still happened, whether it continued or whether it didn't. But that sort of failure to disclose at the end is sort of, and Cobb's decision to not look, he becomes transfixed by his family, is kind of the main thing to sort of take away from it. But no, I also found it funny that the dream sharing program was designed in the military. I thought that was an interesting little moment in the film that they sort of slip underneath. But no, I mean, obviously I think we could have a lot of these debates in relation to Tenet to see what kind of happens there, and so that was in my mind. That was one of the few films I managed to get to the cinema to see over the summer before we sort of went back into our shells again. But I mean, I love films about the crisis of time, the crisis of space. If Inception is a mind heist, then I guess Avengers Endgame is our time heist. So what other senses are going to happen next? But no, I loved it a lot more than I have done previously, and perhaps it is slightly better than the Adjustment Bureau.
I think Adjustment Bureau is pretty good, though. So I would say that I think that the one thing we haven't really talked about is the character of Maul, and I feel like, and we talked a little bit about her, but I feel like she's one of those characters that, and I think it relates to the way we talked about absence, because she's constantly, the film depicts her as the figure of, like, she's really Maul in the French sense of evil, right? Like she's a figure seemingly of evil. She's constantly thwarting their plans. And yet I think what the film is trying to say, there's a way in which she's really the figure that most gets what the film is trying to say about the importance of the fiction and our investment in it, and how that's more important than, is this real or is it not real? And so I've always thought that Nolan really invested the figure of Maul in this as almost the central character of the film. And I think it's interesting to reread the film from, like, viewing her as having this insight that Cobb doesn't have, that he needs to come to, and that we as spectators need to come to. So I guess that's the only thing that I feel like we didn't I didn't fully flesh out, that I think is a really important aspect of it, and in the way it ties to all the things we were saying about absence and fiction.
And the way she sort of structures the various layers, I guess, to sort of bow and everything, and that she's one of the only characters that seems to be able to be in different. The layers aren't a process of going up and down for her. She just seems to be able to transcend all that, and that gives her a certain extra diegetic quality as well. Right. Terrific. I mean, I've taken a lot from that, so I'm sure listeners will too. And I believe Inception is on the UK A-level syllabus. So any A-level students out there, I hope that was helpful for your exams this year, because I know you've had a troubled year. Todd, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. If people, so I'm sure the fictional Christopher Nolan is still available and out there in the world and available for eager new film readers to digest.
Yeah, as far as I know, you can still buy it. Yeah.
Great, terrific. Well, please do check that out. And do you have any social media presence or anything at all you'd like to plug?
I have a little podcast that I do, but it's called the Why Theory Podcast. So yeah, we I don't think we've talked about Nolan, but we do a film thing occasionally, but it's mostly theoretical, like Hegel and psychoanalysis.
Sounds great to me. I'm signing up. Available to download. Terrific. Chris, I will see you. Oh, I have to do the admin now, don't I?
You always have to. If I do it, I'll get it wrong, and it'll be animation/fantasy, and we won't know where we are. We'll be back. We'll be backwards. It'll be Inception-like. So.
Right, very quickly then, you can of course find us at fantasy-animation.org, where you can read our latest blog posts and download past episodes of the podcast. We're at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research, across all social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. Take part in the conversations there. Let us know your favourite Christopher Nolan movie and why, and we'll endeavour to have a little chat about it and keep these conversations flowing, because they are rich, complicated, and delve into many different layers. But that has been us for this episode, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
No.